So our final panel, it consists of all of our panelists who are still here. Absolutely, yes. The plan here is actually just to allow any questions that you have for any of the panelists. And we'll take those. Oh, we already have one at the back there. Walt, thank you.
Hi, my name is Walt Behringer. I'm Senior Editor for News Operations at the New York Times, former IPTC delegate. Hello, everybody. I just want to expand something on Evan's presentation briefly. The scanning of our pages was done in a serendipitous way also. We didn't control the rights for our own page images because the company at one point saw no need to, so they were sold away. And the microfilms were kept in a vault in Michigan. And one day they approached us and wanted to scan the pages and needed our assistance. And what was interesting was who was going to pay for it. There was a specific industry that wanted to scan all the newspapers in the United States and add their own metadata. Can anybody think of what industry it was, really quick? I think Evan knows, but it was the insurance industry. They wanted to be able to find fire and flood stories easily, and they paid to have about 300 newspapers in the US scanned completely. It was extremely expensive, cost many millions. I think ours was $2 million just for ours, and they paid for it. It's kind of interesting where these things come from and where you end up finding the value. And of course, all the metadata they added was just, is it a fire story, flood story, burglary story, crime story? We had to go back later, several years later, and add real metadata to make it useful for the public. But the insurance industry is basically responsible for scanning most of the newspapers in the United States.
Thank you. Any other questions for any of the panelists? I have one that I wanted to ask about. One of the things I was thinking about is we've talked a lot today about the transition from sort of traditional ways of publishing to more digital ones and so on. And in the process, we talked a lot about needing to get the news to where the people formerly known as readers are. So whether it's social media, mobile platforms, periscope of watching of things, and so on. But a lot of these platforms, as we've talked about, are actually not owned directly by publishers. So whether it's the Apple or Facebook and so on, or Twitter, etc. So doesn't that cause a bit of an issue in terms of monetization and in terms of getting to know your customers and so on? And also, if you think even on our own, for publishers' own platforms, the rise of things like ad blockers and so on. So that's a bit of a challenge there too. So how in the long term then are publishers going to sustain themselves in the face of those sorts of changes?
I'm the least qualified, so I'll answer first. And it's why I asked the question that I asked earlier in the earlier panel. I guess my advice is pay attention, because in my experience, and again, it goes across a lot of sectors, publishers initially often don't understand where the real value is. So for example, the same thing that the Times was saying about them having sold off all those back issues in the scholarly journal industry years ago, many scientific and scholarly journals basically just turned over the digital rights to the aggregators. In fact, I think ProQuest was probably who worked with you, and they acquired lots of those rights, and EBSCO and Blackwell's and lots of those aggregators. And suddenly these journals, because the journals thought, well, this is just little ancillary income. This is just the icing on the cake to get income from these digital sales. We do these print journals. 5 years later, they weren't doing print journals. All the income was digital. And yet, they no longer had the rights to that. So, be careful.
And I'll also say an example from Europe is Axel Springer, for example. It's traditionally a news company, but they're making all their money somewhere else, or most of their money somewhere else. So I'm not saying abandon news at all. I'm just saying diversify. Look to other income streams. News will be, of course, the core of the company for many, many years to come. But there are alternative income streams out there, and they need to be explored.
And different, it's going to be a mixed model, isn't it? And you can see it. And I think there's huge amounts of things to be optimistic about. Walter, I think the number you quoted to me earlier is public, isn't it? Yeah. The million subscribers. Well, so 1 million paying digital subscribers on the New York Times is an extraordinary number. You know, the fact that the Guardian now, I believe it is a publicly quoted number, 80 million of digital revenues off a monthly audience for the Guardian of 120 million people a month. Fantastic. You know, for us, we have a very different and more complex model. Our sustainability is around demonstrating value to our license fee payers in the UK. Outside of the UK, we're a commercial business. We're driving £100 million a year in revenues across TV and online from news. But it's a mixed model. For us, our mix is syndication of TV content as well as digital advertising. So it's around being adaptable, and critically, it's about quality and scale, isn't it? And in the case of the subscription-based organisations, being able to get that hook of getting people where they want that deep, engaged model. But I think there's a huge amount for us all to be optimistic about.
So I'm again going to dodge the core of your question as a New York Times employee, but as a member of the board of the International Press Telecommunications Council, I think that your question points to a very vital role that this organization plays. There have been a number of occasions over the 5 years that I've been involved with this organization, where a standard like AMP, or prior to that, schema.org, Facebook Open Graph, Twitter Cards, were proposed that in some way took our content, sort of out of our direct control and placed it into other platforms. And in a lot of those conversations, the IPTC has been able to connect with the players at those organizations that are involved with moving that effort along and express and shape the standards that those publishers then use for requesting that data. Probably most pronounced in the case of schema.org, but just yesterday we had a gentleman from Google come and share the AMP effort with us. So we remain, I think, a vital place for having these conversations because, as your question indicates, these are very real concerns for the kinds of organizations in this room. Right. So for all of you who control the IPTC budgets in this room, just consider that.
Here and then, yep. You first. Up front here. Yep.
Thank you. A quick comment and then a question. The comment is many, many thanks to the people responsible for organizing this, to Stuart and to Michael and Stefan. Great opportunity for the group to get together and celebrate this 50 years, so many thanks to you. I was struck listening to Stefan's presentation about the foundation of the IPTC, about how little things have changed in the last 50 years. And so the question is, my goodness, given the acceleration of change that we have seen in the last years, what on earth is the IPTC going to be looking at or doing even 10 or 20 years from now, much less 50?
Okay. I think I'd be interested in hearing what this panel said too, but if I can also answer that question. A lot of the work that we do within IPTC, all of it, in fact, is driven by the needs of the members. So the people who participate in the group or who want to participate, they come to us with the business problems, and sometimes those are turned into efforts to create standards. Sometimes it's actually really just ways to help different news providers of all different sizes better understand each other and the needs of customers. So examples are, we've looked at things like APIs for the news and so on. We didn't think there was any need to create a standard, but it actually helped us to better understand why do people want APIs, what could they be used for, and so on. Rights is another example where we ended up not really creating a standard that was separate, we decided let's work with the W3C actually to create something that would work for people across the board. So it's really driven that way. I do think that there is also an opportunity to go back to some of IPTC's roots. One of the things that Stefan was quoting, and I wrote it down because I thought it was so interesting, was the bit about IPTC is uniting forces to counter the arbitrary decisions and policies of the ITU. And I guess we showed them because I've never even heard of the ITU recently. But it could be that there are other large organizations that are creating arbitrary decisions or would like to dominate what the news industry does. And so perhaps there is a role there for IPTC membership to take a more of a united stand. Again, so it's not just the large companies, but also companies of all sizes and across the world. We could unite that way if that's something that we, the members of the news industry, want to do. So those are my answers. Any further comments on that?
I just want to tag and circle what Stuart said there. The most value that I feel that my organization has gotten out of the IPTC over the last 5 years has been precisely these kinds of conversations where we were able to, as an organization, come to some consensus about our view on a fairly detailed technical matter, be it schema.org or some of the other things that have been discussed this evening, and be able to speak with a voice as an industry to these big organizations that are establishing the ecosystem that that we operate in. And I'm very hopeful that this will continue to be the continue to be a place where these conversations happen. There's not really another organization quite like this that combines the technical knowledge and the sort of business concerns into a single organization. And I think that's something that I think we can build a very, very bright future on.
Yeah, excellent.
One here now. Just quickly, because we've got a couple more questions and there are drinks waiting for us. That's all I'm saying. Okay, so I think right here. Yep.
Hi, I'm Angela Murphy. I have, my main question is about, we all know there's a business case for creating these standards and working together on these standards, but the difficult part is actually producing a business case for people who don't know it. They kind of generally know it, but so I'd like to know if you've got any stories that can help all of us produce these business cases. And just a side question, can you tell me, are you getting really rich user information in your pilot from Google?
Well, so the case studies in the pilot. So the thing with Google Amp, although it's announced and the demo site is live, it's not live. They need to be able to. They want as many other publishers to get on board as possible before it goes fully live, and then do a big change to the search algorithms probably early in the new year, I think. But what we see back is exactly the same data we see if we publish things normally, because it's just tagged up with ComScore or whatever. So you get good aggregate data. The issue is you don't get anything around who the user is, and that was my key point earlier this morning, that I think we need to focus on the standards of who is consuming across these different environments, not just aggregate numbers. And I think it's only by publishers and broadcasters working together to come up with what we believe is that answer, and then going to these platforms and saying, no, this is what, as an industry, we think you need to be able to, is part of the deal. I think it's a massive issue for us to address. Case studies on standards of how to do things quickly. I mean, the one for me is actually is something the BBC was involved with. I was involved with it before I worked at the BBC, which was actually in the radio industry, and the radio DNS example, which is talking about, I thought your examples across different industries are fascinating. And the radio DNS one, for me, was a really interesting case study where it was exactly as you said, by people voluntarily giving up their time to define a basic metadata standard that you put alongside an FM radio stream. They were able to create something that created the UK radio player and is built into radios across the world. It was a service that was able to be launched for a matter of hundreds of thousands of pounds rather than millions and millions of pounds. That brought different companies together. So I think there's lots of case studies, and I think going beyond different sectors is a really key thing to do.
And in terms of just concrete benefit, so one example is that a lot of the educational publishers have been working around developing an EPUB-based standard for their infrastructures and publications, like I said. The whole point is, don't spend your time and your energy and your innovation on the plumbing. Let's just all agree on the plumbing, the basic foundation for how these things work, so that you can devote your attention to actually building on top of that. And the best example I have of that is Apple. Because, you know, there are differences between these behemoth organizations. Some of them are a little more public-spirited than others. Apple's actually been a big contributor to a lot of these standards groups. Google's a huge contributor to most of them. So they're not bad guys, but they have a right to build proprietary, competitively attractive solutions on top of these standard foundations. But they help build the foundations in the first place. That's a good thing.
Thanks. I think we had a question right at the front.
Just very quick.
And then at the back.
Research, I mean, I'm into heart and love standards, but I think the rate change I'm seeing, not only in the data area, but in a lot of SIPC, AMWAR, etc., areas like that, is actually it's not going to be about standards, it's about interoperability. I think IPTC needs to be very open, not only becoming a standards body, but being able to set the standards around interoperability across a lot of products. I mean, what you just said about Apple, plumbing, but how do we then integrate that? And I think that's a big role to play in the future. Because I think if you're going to try and set standards in the future, frankly, you're not going to be able to keep up. It's going to change. You keep up with all of Apple's products 2, 3 a year, better man than me with stuff.
I think that's really interesting because this is a little in the weeds, but there's an IPTC effort right now called the Semantic Exchange, and the idea behind that effort is that the IPTC publishes a reference vocabulary of basically 4,000 subject tags that you can apply to your stuff. This is a sports story. Specifically, it is an American rules football sports story. And the Semantic Exchange encourages publishers to map their own vocabularies to this reference vocabularies and then share that mapping with their customers so that somebody like the New York Times that takes feeds from multiple providers can have an easier time integrating across providers because we understand how their tagging vocabularies relate to each other. So I think it's interesting that you say that because we have started to look at data interoperability as a path forward for some of our standards work.
Right. So one last question. Walt at the back.
Not so much a question, but talking about what IPTC brings and what we need to look for in the next 20 years, one of the things that IPTC always offered and struck me in my 15 years at IPTC, being a delegate, was the ethical concerns. The news industry is almost unique in that our rights are enshrined in many constitutions and basic laws of nations. And there have been proposals over the years, sometimes small, sometimes big, that could have affected the rights of the press and of journalism if they were enforced. And the IPTC had ethical discussions about whether these should go forward or not. And it's unique. I don't think other standards bodies go through quite the content discussion that we have because we're also content creators, most of us here. And I represent the newsroom, and there over the years we have seen things in other standards bodies that have been not to the best interest of a free press. And what I think it comes down to with the IPTC is it helps move forward the idea of a free press, self-governing body of the press, that is working with other bodies to make sure that the standards that do move forward don't suppress a free press and free journalism.
Great. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank all of our panelists, and I'd like to thank all of you for great discussions. Thank you very much.